It's important that you really keep in mind that China is online and it's digital. No brand will succeed without a very strong digital strategy entering that market. Okay, that's key takeaway. Number two, China is not homogenous. I keep saying this in all of my talks, Asia is not China, right? China in and of itself is already very complex, and it's a fast-moving market. What we're sharing with you today is already outdated. That's how quickly this market is evolving. So if you're serious about this market, there are a lot of publications that have committed a lot of resources to make sure that they are covering this market up to the minute. New York Times is doing a fantastic job, Financial Times, and if you want something within the region, the South China Morning Post, which is the most read English daily in Asia, is also very robust with their China coverage. So that's something that I would advise that you stay on top of. China's fast moving, we discussed that already, and as Jenny has said, it's a pay-to-play market. You know, yes, even if you capture that 0.01% of that market, and which could mean a huge, potential, you have to come with the right investment. It is a very complex market. Okay. And this is something that we've noticed recently. The Chinese consumers know that they have the power. And this is not something that I could say 10 years ago because of very different dynamics. But today, the market has matured so much, and there is a strong sense of national pride. They know that they have the power. They are making brands bend to their will. So that's something to keep in mind. And last but not the least, China does not, they want your respect, they don't want your love. And I say this to segue into the last concept of face. I mean, how many of you have heard about face, giving face? So 2 or 3. This is a very difficult concept to try and explain in a matter of minutes. Suffice to say that the concept of face informs everything in Chinese society. It informs the way they interact with their own communities, the way you see global politics being played out right now with the tensions, the trade talks, and what have you. Face also informs why the luxury market is so dependent and driven entirely by the Chinese market. So it's important that if you're going to go into this market, that you understand the cultural sensitivities relating to face and respecting that, and so on and so forth. Brands that go into this market are not aware of simple nuances like avoiding the 3 T's, which is Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen. You have to keep that in mind. Marriott Hotels last year had to shut down their website because they mistakenly listed Taiwan and Tibet as 2 separate countries. So the entire website had to be shut down. So little things like that. China feels that they have been robbed of their place in history. And it is only now that they are finally filling their rightful place in the global stage. And the Chinese often look at playing the long game. They believe that a show of emotion is actually a sign of weakness. So when it comes to negotiations, they're very poker face. So a lot of the cultural nuances of face are something that even I, having lived in Asia now for over 21 years, is something that I have to wrap my head around all the time. You will have the Chinese spending so much in making sure that they wear all the top brands, but while living in a hovel, because it's important that they present this face to, a sign of status and prestige to the marketplace. So, there's a lot of expressions of face, and there's a lot that you can read about this, but this is something that I think it should inform the way you put your packages together, the way you behave, and the way you interact with this marketplace. So I wanted to just end this with a few, just key takeaways again about your China strategy and break it down to 3 buckets that you need to keep in mind. Your brand, I mean, your market entry, your brand, the importance of having a Chinese brand name. Now, we work with a lot of companies that we either help them come up with a Chinese brand name or we actually concept test their Chinese brand name. We can always tell when they've asked somebody in their office who just happens to come from a Chinese origin to put together a few characters for them, or that they actually did something through Google Translate because it doesn't make any sense. There's so much at stake with your Chinese brand name. I can't even tell you the significance of that. Remember, with over 30,000 characters, we have 30,000 characters. So you can translate your name literally, you can translate it phonetically, you can translate it symbolically. So there are many different ways that it can be done. And just to show you how easily you can trip up is Airbnb recently went through an exhaustive process of coming up with their own brand name in China and spent enormously for it, only to come up with a name that subtly feels like, sounds like a love hotel. And it was completely thrashed in digital cyberspace. So that they didn't do well with that one. So your nomenclature program is very key. Your marketing collaterals, if you want this market, obviously, are your marketing platforms available in Chinese? And the right language and the right colloquialisms are also represented. And also an awareness of, having an awareness of whether or not your brand has any awareness in that market. Just because you're well known in the United States, it doesn't mean that you're going to be well known in Asia or in China for that matter. And that's something to keep in mind. We've worked with many brands. I mean, Hard Rock, Hard Rock is a long history of decades of having been part of American pop culture. You go into China and it's lost in translation. It means nothing. So if you're going there, it really helps to just get some kind of a read about what do the Chinese marketplace think about your product, think about your brand before you actually craft your strategy. The other thing is, obviously, digital is key. Digital is very, very important. When you're talking to your partners, people that you're going to help bring you into the market, this is something that has to be in the center of your strategy. And last but not the least is the experience. Everything from the touch points of the guest journey, it's so critical to keep in mind, the Chinese profile, whether or not, in terms of how you put if you're a hotel group, your concierge programs, whether you have Chinese language, to the in-room amenities that you put in place, whether you have teapots and the availability of hot water because it's very important to them, to even the way you put your buffet together. I mean, I remember I was in San Francisco a couple of years ago and I was staying in a very simple Marriott Courtyard hotel, and there was a big pot of congee, which is the rice porridge, and that already told me these people are dealing with a large part of Chinese market. They may be a small hotel. So little things like that, but also making sure that your staff are trained and well trained in the nuances of Chinese culture and the way they behave. I mean, sometimes it can be quite jarring because we just see that, why are they screaming or why are they making a lot of noise? I remember when the Maldives was completely overrun by Chinese tourists and we had, hoteliers and GMs who were like, do we want this market? Do we not want this market? Do we want this market? And not understanding what this means and how to deal with it and how to diffuse situations. So you really have to think about that when you craft your products and your guest experiences. Is how do you capture this market? I mean, I remember we were talking to one cruise liner where the CEO of that cruise liner was telling us, I'm Chinese, and I actually had to tell them, please guys, don't hang your knickers out to air, out on the deck, because that's actually not cool. Because they wouldn't know otherwise that that's not something that you do, right? So these are the things that you kind of have to be aware of. The market is catching up very quickly. The government is making huge investments in, public service training to make sure that Chinese travelers are not the laughing stock of the global travel community. I mean, everything from training them how to behave to banning them from traveling if they misbehave. They actually confiscate their passports. If there have been any incidents where they had meltdowns and it was captured on video, the government can confiscate your passport. So there's an effort that, at least from the current perspective, that they want to make sure that the Chinese travelers don't become the cliched, ugly, what we call the ugly Americans of the 70s. Now it's the ugly Chinese. So that's changing very, very quickly. There is a tremendous potential with this market. It goes without saying, just because of the sheer size of this market. It's tremendous. And what I often tell our partners is, even if you're not interested in the Chinese market today, at some point, they will comprise a portion of your strategy. Because one way or the other, we say all roads lead to Rome. Well, in this case, all roads may not lead to China, but they will certainly pass through it. Okay? Thank you.